Welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. This is an affiliated school with the Party of Communist USA, which is great because we'll get a diversity of ideas here. Today, we have a class on the integration of Black baseball players into the major leagues and the Popular Front. So today's class is going to be on the desegregation of baseball and the Popular Front. What we'll be talking about is first the Communist Party in sports and the Popular Front. Then we'll talk about the American communist journalist Lester Rodney of the Daily Worker and the fight to desegregate baseball. Then we'll talk a little bit about the Negro National League and breaking the color line in baseball. On the left there, we just have a soccer club member with a very obvious symbol that I think we might be familiar with. So a lot of the slides came from this book, which is a hard book to find from Temple Publishing, the university. It's written by Erwin Sibler. It's called Press Box Red, The Story of Lester Rodney, the communist who helped break the color line in American sports. So in this book, it's really just an interview of Lester Rodney that Erwin Sibler is facilitating. So we'll start with the party, sports, and the Popular Front. And we'll go back a little bit before then to the 1930s. Okay, until the early 1930s, the party's membership was made up largely of European immigrants who had brought with them a tradition of workers' sports associations, organized principally by socialist and communist parties. In some Central European countries, membership in such organizations numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The main sports these immigrants enjoyed playing and watching were soccer, or also known as football, volleyball, gymnastics, and track and field. And if you look there to the right, once again, we'll see another team. Was established by the Labor Sports Union, which was a coalition of worker athletic clubs, and they were primarily located in the Northeast and the Midwest. And one of their successful sporting accomplishments was the Workers' Soccer Association. And this communist soccer league played 2 seasons per year and competed for city, regional, and national championships. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this team was actually in New York City. The Party and the Daily Worker in sports. So this is still before the Popular Front, which came out of the Comintern of 1935. But we're going to go before then in what they reported about in sports. In 1927, acknowledging their own members' interest in sports and trying to reach out to others of similar national background, the U.S. Communist Party helped establish the Labor Sports Union, the LSU. And while the Daily Worker occasionally reported on the LSU's activities, one can find their announcement of an Eastern District wrestling meet and a workers' table tennis meet, along with the standings of the Metropolitan Workers Basketball League and the schedule of the Metropolitan Workers Soccer League. So they just reported also on like the standings of what these soccer clubs or what these teams were doing. Regular communist coverage of sports was to be found only in the pages of the Young Communist League's monthly newspaper, The Young Worker. And here's an example right here. And it's actually talking about baseball. In 1933, staff writer Ben Field ventured out to report on a Dodgers-Giants game at Brooklyn's Ebbets Field. Here, the Dodgers now, they're in LA, but back in the day, the Brooklyn Dodgers were a fierce team to be reckoned with. Noting the typically raucous comments of the fans as they responded to the ebb and flow of the game, Field wrote, "Are these bad elements? Many are workers who have so identified themselves with their team that they cannot sleep or eat when the team loses. The leanness of American life under capitalism drives them to this fever." Nevertheless, Field did make a certain kind of history when he wrote, "You spot a few Negro fans. Negro workers make good athletes. But where are the Negro on the field? The big leagues will not admit Negro players. There is something else to chalk up against capitalist-controlled sports. And this was the first time that the Daily Worker highlighted the issue that, a few years later, would become one of the hallmarks of its sports section. And that is the question about blacks in the major league. And so here you can actually see some of the stats. They just look like what you would see in newspapers today, or if you just kind of search for your favorite team online, you could just see the stats. And here's another person that we may be familiar with, Mike Gould's contribution to journalism in sports. Mike Gould over on the right there also was a novelist who became famous from the book Jews Without Money. One of the first to realize the significance of this change in the party's view of sports was the novelist and Daily Worker columnist Mike Gould. Soon after the Comintern Congress, Gould turned his fire on those Daily Worker readers who had registered opposition to the idea of instituting regular sports coverage in the paper. You can condemn them for it if you are built that way. You can call baseball a form of bourgeois opium for the masses. But that doesn't get around the fact that the vast ocean of Americans, of whom we are yet a minority, adore baseball. What are we going to do? Insist that they give up this taste? Are we going to maintain our isolation and make Americans stop their baseball before we will condescend to explain communism to them? When you run the news of a strike alongside the news of a baseball game, you are making American workers feel at home. It gives them the feeling that communism is nothing strange and foreign. Let's loosen up. Let's begin to prove that one can be a human being as well as a communist. And so now we get to the Popular Front era, which, as we may know, comes from the Comintern. So on July 25th, 1935, at the historic 7th World Congress of the Communist Third International, Comintern, held in Moscow, the assembled 76 communist parties of the world adopted a major shift in political outlook. Spurred by the growth of fascism and the rise of Hitler in Germany, the Comintern dropped its previous focus on the promotion of world revolution in favor of building in every country a broad-based popular front against war and fascism. Communism as American as apple pie and baseball. So on the left there we have Earl Browder, who was the general secretary during the time of the Comintern. More explicitly, in the new approach was the view that communist parties should no longer divorce themselves from their respective national traditions and culture. And that meant for the U.S. Communist Party in particular, it meant that a new and heightened emphasis on what was already a nominal goal, the party's Americanization. And as our old Browder said, we are the Americans, and communism is Americanism of the 20th century. Here's an example of the push in the Popular Front. So one spinoff of the turn to Popular Front politics was a decision to begin a weekend edition of the Daily Worker that was called the Sunday Worker, which you see something there on the right. That would be aimed at reaching a broader audience than the daily paper did. The first issue of the new Sunday edition of the Daily Worker, the Sunday Worker, appeared on January 12th, 1936. And that's not the same issue that we have there on the right. Opening its new tabloid-sized pages, the readers found cartoons, comic strips, catchy headlines, new bylines, along with some old ones, in addition to 3 full pages of movie, theater, and music reviews. There were featured articles dealing with great moments in American history, a women's page featuring household hints, recipes, articles on parenting, and a short fiction with a working-class bent. But most astonishing of all, perhaps, were the 2 full pages devoted to sports. Gone were the ponderous dismissals of professional sports as nothing but an ideological tool of the bosses and the patronizing about content about the fans who came out of the games. It was probably one of the first issues of this new weekend edition of the Daily Worker that Lester Rodney, The communist who helped break the color line in American sports found himself thumbing through on a January winter's night on the New York University campus. Many of the individuals who ran the Daily Worker and the Sunday Worker, however, had little understanding or knowledge of American sports. Their earliest once-a-week efforts proved heavy-handed and propaganda-laden. Reading these dispatches prompted Lester Rodney, a freelance writer, to send a letter suggesting a different approach. Rodney had grown up in Brooklyn, an avid athlete and fan of baseball. Rodney believed that sports page, even one in communist newspaper, must not only critique the flaws of capitalist athletics, but also convey the love of the game that drew fans to them. To Rodney, sport was not an opiate for the masses, but an important component of people's lives and culture. His enthusiasm convinced the editors of the Daily Worker to entrust him with responsibility for a new daily sports section. And finally, this is the last slide for this section. Even while racial barriers were eroding in other sports as a result of the breakthrough of Jesse Owens and his fellow Black stars at the 1936 Berlin Olympics and the accomplishments of Joe Louis and Henry Armstrong in the boxing ring, organized baseball remained lily white. Rodney Lester says, our biggest asset, though, was that the tune was light Black athletes had stolen the show at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, especially Jesse Owens, who won tour of 5 gold medals. And Hitler had made such a big deal about his Aryan athletes, and he was so embarrassed he couldn't even shake the hands of the American blacks. This all over the newspaper, which had these marvelous pictures of Black medal winners draped with the American flag. And Joe Louis was on his way to the heavyweight title, the last time there'd be a Black heavyweight champion in more than 20 years. So it was a good time to say, why not baseball as well? And this is just a picture of Joe Louis, who won by KO against the German Max Schmeling when Hitler was in power of the Second World War looming. Louis was cast as the defender of democracy against Schmeling, the hero of Nazi Germany. And there, we will break for questions.
This is fascinating. It is really fascinating. It reminds me of Lenin when he said, we have to go where the masses are, even if they're in reactionary organizations. We have to go where they are. We cannot stay apart from them in our own sectarian small circles. That's a quote from Lenin, by the way. And he told us to stop the red trade union movement and go into the trade union movement of our countries. That's when the policy was to go into the building the CIO. And then when it joined the AFL, we went into the AFL-CIO. I'm a trade unionist. That's what we were told to do. And it works. There are fishes, schools of fishes. We have to be fishing, swimming with those fish. Mao Zedong said that. Swim with the fishes, not separate from them. So this idea of identifying with the culture, the everyday culture of a people works. Not only does it work, we went from 20,000 to over 150,000. Can you imagine that? We were so important that the President of the United States, FDR, asked communists to become part of his close cabinet to deal with the fighting World War II. And that's why McCarthy in the 50s said, I have here a list of communists in the State Department. He was correct. There were communists in the State Department. So we were sitting at the table making decisions. We were not off to the side. Thank you.
Thank you for that addition.
Yeah, just a couple comments. The language, in order to, since we're recorded and there are many people listening, for referring to Black people as Black people, Black American, African American people, not just blacks. That's considered offensive by many black people. And then secondly, I wanted to add something to the Earl Browder addition to this, that you had on the slides. There is a basically Earl Browder, like he led the party during the World War II era, and the Comintern, talking about the Popular Front specific, and that was a correct position during that period of time. But him adhering to that after the strategic alliance had degenerated led eventually to the degeneration of the old CPUSA. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and we will definitely have to discuss, Earl Browder's liquidation of party stuff later for another class. But I mean, I would say that deserves its own class in itself. But thank you for those comments.
Yeah, it makes me think, today, I don't really follow sports that closely. I'm not a big sports person, but what I do know is in a lot of the European soccer or football leagues, whatever you want to call them, they have clubs where it's like basically a mass organization for fascists. And very stark contrast is we don't see many, if any, communist clubs like these today. So I think this is very important that we're talking about it. We need to, keep this in mind when we're building popular fronts.
Absolutely. And I know there are, I would say, leftist clubs in Europe too. And so, there really is an opening here for us communists, the true conservative Americans, to actually push that. All right, comrade, you have the floor.
Yeah, and this might be something I'll talk about later, but I wanted to drop into not only a sport and sports in general, a very important part of culture, an important way of sharing identities and sharing and telling stories. It also, in America especially, has a lot of cross connections. If you live in a town with a sports team, you have most likely, in fact, I'm pretty sure you're guaranteed that your city, county, state has paid a lot of money to build a stadium for your team. Almost every single stadium being built in the past 30 years has been private or publicly funded using taxpayer dollars. They're not going to schools, they're not going to affordable housing, they're not going to transportation, they're not going to wages. Sports teams are trying to use non-labor union construction workers, non-unionized stadium staff. Sports leagues are trying to break all the sports unions, which are sadly some of the strongest ones still left in the nation, compared to a lot of our other unions.
60 seconds.
Big things like that. There's a lot to talk about in terms of politics and where sports collide.
Absolutely. And that just happened here in Kansas City, where we had a referendum on a tax to move the stadium to downtown Kansas City, which would have destroyed it and gentrified it, kept people that were homeless in worse conditions and made more homeless. And it was really the fans of sports, of the Royals and the Kansas City Chiefs, that actually pushed for that to not happen. And so it really is important to get the fans on your side.
That just makes me think about in Georgia, they wanted to use funds for unemployment insurance to fund the construction of like a $90 million stadium. I believe that was a scandal with the governor, and I don't remember the outfits.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's happening all around the country. All right, Comrade New York, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. A couple things I want to reply, a couple comments here. First, for Comrade, there even in the U.S. with the soccer clubs, there are teams that have subsections of fans, clubs of fans that are left wing. I know here in the New York area, the New York Red Bulls have a group called Frente Rojo, which is all left wing supporters of the team, and there's a lot of left wing teams in Europe as well. And on this taxpayer spending on sports stadiums, There's two big ones recently, and it led to teams moving. One was in Arizona, where the formerly Arizona Coyotes, were trying to build a stadium, and it was the labor movement that blocked it because they were trying to use non-union labor.
60
And
seconds.
they ended up moving to Utah, and also out in Oakland. They wanted to move the Oakland A's to a port along the waterfront stadium, and it was the ILU that stepped up because not only would it gentrify the area, it would have eliminated a lot of port jobs in Oakland.
Thank you. Yeah, we still have a little bit of time. So, Angelo, New York, you have the floor.
Make it quick. In Germany, under Hitler, the position of the party was to join because Hitler got rid of all the unions. So they set up, was going to the fascist unions. Join the fascist unions. Interesting. And that's where the workers are, because that's the only thing that was allowed. So we got to join in order to work in there against fascism. That should be really in people's minds. And the thing is, my experience in 1970, I went around and had a paper out in Staten Island for a daily newspaper that the party put out called the Daily World. Well, we had a section in that paper for recipes. I want you to know that people got a subscription because they liked the recipes in the paper. So now that paper is in their house, sitting on their table in the kitchen. And everyone now can look at it throughout the paper and see other things that are in the paper. That's the way we get our messages into the homes of the average American. Thank you.
Absolutely. And let's go into that in a little more detail with the next section. And then we'll read a little bit and then we'll go to a video. All right. So the next section is American communist journalist Lester Rodney, the Daily Worker, and the fight to desegregate baseball. So Lester Rodney mentioned all this. This is him talking in the book. By the time I got to NYU in the 30s, I still didn't know much about communism. I was working odd depression-type jobs by day and going to NYU at night. I wasn't looking for a degree or anything, just picking a few courses that interested me. Journalism, socialism, political science, but you couldn't avoid the political discussions that went on everywhere. And I used to argue with the communists at first. I'd use the same arguments that people later used against me, like, we probably all have heard this, you can't change human nature, and things like that. And here's something else that it should be Lester Rodney said on getting a press pass. That's the press pass to actually go into the boxes in the fields in baseball. The first thing I did was write to the secretary of the Baseball Writers Association, the BBWA of America. I told him the Daily Worker had started a sports section and I was covering baseball and wanted to be a member. And they wrote back and said, in effect, you'd better get a track record first. And so it took a year before I was admitted as a working professional for a regular sports section. They wanted to see that we were really covering sports, not just writing quote unquote communist propaganda. In general, I got along pretty well with the other writers. They got a kick just out of my being around. Newspapermen liked the offbeat. And I wasn't there as a communist, but as a sports writer. They knew where I stood politically, but I didn't preach to them. You know, in all my years as a sports writer, nobody ever raised the question whether a communist should be allowed in the press box, not even in the McCarthy years during the 50s. Because they knew me. I'm a fellow working sports writer, and I'm knowledgeable. We covered, and so this is another important point about how they covered the articles in the Daily Worker on sports. We covered the games just the same as the other sports writers, but in addition, we began to introduce these other questions, but separate. We didn't write stories about how the Dodgers defeated the Giants 3-2, and so pitched, and then in the next sentence say, but where were the black players? We just ran sports stories, but separately in the same page. we began raising the question of Black players. So that should be evident. One article talking about the game, another article actually talking about how they need to integrate Black Americans into the sport. Okay, so now we're going to play this video that is also running at the National Negro Baseball League Museum here in Kansas City in a room. Anyways, let me just go into play. It's about Lester Rodney.
The people today would find it hard to believe that halfway through the 20th century in the land of the free, players who might be qualified to play in our national pastime were not permitted to play because of the pigmentation of their skin. Well, actually, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I had a normal boyhood. We played a lot of ball in the streets at that time. 1929 happened, and we lost everything. At that time in New York, if you weren't some kind of ist, communist, socialist, questioning the workings of capitalism, you were considered sort of brain dead.
Lester Rodney was a 25-year-old aspiring journalist when he was hired to create a sports page for the Daily Worker, New York's Communist Party newspaper. With the freedom to explore social issues of the day, Rodney quickly made breaking the color barrier in baseball his signature issue. Rodney wasn't the only journalist calling for an end to baseball segregation, but nobody beat the drum louder than Lester Rodney.
Here I am writing about baseball, and I see some of the great Negro League teams playing. I know how good Josh Gibson is, for instance, the greatest catcher who ever put on a uniform, by the way. The point was I felt an immediate vacuum in baseball, that nobody is addressing this thing.
Outlawed by baseball, the crime of the big leagues. One of the most sordid stories in American sports. Though they win laurels for America in the Olympics, though they have proven themselves outstanding baseball stars, Negroes have been placed beyond the pale of the American and National Leagues. Read the truth about this carefully laid conspiracy. Beginning next Sunday, the Daily Worker will rip the veil from the crime of the big leagues, naming names, giving facts, sparing none of the most sacred figures in baseball's officialdom. August 10th, 1936.
A lot of people don't even know how good these players are, that they're good enough to play. And the next thing we're going to do is challenge baseball's big shots. Judge Landis, Ford Frick, Will Harridge, the presidents of the National American League. And we did that. We said, is there a written ban against Negro? That was the operative word then. A hem and a haw and say, no, there's no written ban, but it's up to the owners, and they don't want them, and the players don't want them, wouldn't tolerate them, so it's not an issue.
Fans, it's up to you. Tell the big league magnates that you're sick of the poor pitching American League. You want to see Satchel Paige out there on the mound. You're tired of the flop teams like Boston, of the silly Brooklyn Dodgers, of the inept Philadelphia Phillies, and the semi-pro Athletics. Demand better ball. Demand Americanism in baseball. Equal opportunities for Negro and white. Demand the end of Jim Crow baseball. August 18th, 1936.
I was in the Yankee dressing room, and one of the other sports writers asked Joe, who's the best pitcher you've faced? Thinking in terms of big league, of course, in his year and a half. And Joe DiMaggio, young Joe DiMaggio, said without hesitation Satchel Paige, who he had played against in postseason exhibition games on the West Coast. So he answered the question honestly, The next day I had a big headline, Paige, greatest I've faced, ... DiMaggio, and none of the other papers had that.
Let the winners of the World Series play us just one game at Yankee Stadium, and if we don't beat them, they don't have to pay us.
That was the challenge thrown down yesterday by Satchel Paige, brilliant Negro pitcher at the unwritten Jim Crow restriction that keeps him and other Negro baseball players from their rightful place in America's national pastime. Paige didn't make that statement boastfully. It was made with a quiet confidence backed by the records.
No all-star team of major leaguers has ever beaten a Negro League team playing on the Pacific Coast after the season. And they had some ball players trying. Joe DiMaggio, Charlie Gehringer, Dizzy Dean. There must be something wrong somewhere.
September 16th, 1937.
In addition to highlighting the Negro players, which was our first task, we did several other things. We stimulated a petition campaign. And that was young people, trade unionists and young communists, outside the 3 big league ballparks in New York whenever they had a game. And they weren't trying to keep people out, they just wanted them to sign a petition. The petition said roughly, would you be willing to have the Yankees or the Giants or the Dodgers sign a Negro player if he were able to make the team? After a year and a half, we had more than 1.5 million petition signatures on Judge Landis's desk.
These players could make champions out of the also-rans in either league. But they are Negroes, and organized baseball says they cannot play. But no voter's ever taken on the subject. No manager or owner dares to defy the Jim Crow tradition, which has been the most inflexible, unwritten law in the game. May 14th, 1940.
We had almost a daily feature. Can you read Judge Landis? And we'd run the box scores showing that more fans attended a black game in Chicago than the white doubleheader. Can you see Judge Landis? I'd show a picture of Satchel Paige, arguably one of the 3 best pitchers this country has ever produced. Can you hear Judge Landis? And this is what the crowds were roaring, marching down through the streets. End Jim Crow in baseball, We kept a steady drumbeat on Landis, and he was rankled by it. Everybody who had any contact with him and who tried to raise this subject knows that he was a stone racist. He refused to talk about it. He said, that's not part of my job. I don't care one way or the other, but as far as I'm concerned, baseball is a white game.
Time for stalling is over, Judge Landis. Negro soldiers and sailors are among the beloved heroes of the American people who have died for the preservation of this country and everything this country stands for. Yes, including the great game of baseball. You may file this away without comment, as you already have to the petitions of more than 1 million baseball fans. You may ignore it as you have ignored the clear statements of the men who play our national pastime and the men who manage the teams. You have refused to acknowledge sports columns and editorials in newspapers throughout the country. The Louisville Courier-Journal last month joined the nationwide demand for the end of Jim Crow in our national pastime and said, baseball in this war should set an example for democracy. May 6th, 1942.
Every year at the start of a season, I'd send a questionnaire to every big league owner. Would you be willing to sign a qualified Negro for your team? And so on. The first positive answer I got was from Bill Benswanger, the owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates. Part of that, I surmise, was that Pittsburgh was actually the heart of black baseball at that time with the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Couriers. Wendell Smith, the sports editor of the Courier, estimates that there were 6 players on those 2 teams that were potentially all-star caliber in the big leagues. They included Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige, Buck Leonard, the first baseman, and Ray Dandridge, the third baseman. Effa Manley, the owner of the Newark Black Eagles, she spoke to me after the campaign was in full swing, and she said kind of bitterly, she said, you people are doing no service to us. You're going to put out of business maybe the best black business in the country, a going concern that uses thousands of black people to work on the ballparks. And she said, you're going to end that if you end the segregation. And she was right, of course. It did put a great business out of it. But she finally came around to the longer view, which was, how about all the young black kids growing up who wanted a chance to play in the big leagues?
In October 1945, Sergeant Lester Rodney was stationed on a remote South Pacific island when he received a telegram from New York. Congratulations, Dodgers signed Jackie Robinson for their Montreal Farm Club. You did it.
The New York Times ran the headlines of the opening day, April 15th, 1947, the cloudy April afternoon when Jackie made his debut. In truth, if someone wanted to know the full story of the ending of discrimination and how it was being coped with, they would have to turn to the Daily Worker or the Negro weeklies. Dick Young at the Daily News came over to me. He says, you know me, you know I hate the guts of communism. He said, but you guys can be proud of this. It was a sort of a conjunction of things. My newfound social passion for justice, including racial justice, and being passionate about baseball. If you love something enough, you want it to be perfect. You don't want it to be racist. And when you change people in baseball, you change America. Baseball changes America. You know, it was 1948 when President Harry Truman announced the desegregation of the armed forces. That was 1 year after Jackie Robinson desegregated America's national pastime. That was no accident. I was just chatting with Leo DeRoche one day before a game, and Leo suddenly turns to me and says, Rodney says, for a communist, you sure know your baseball. I took it as a compliment.
All right. Let's break for discussion and questions. Just a comment real quick. This is anecdotal, but I think it's important. Like I said, that's a video that is played at the Negro Baseball Museum here in Kansas City. It's in a small room. There were two video rooms or movie rooms. And the one that we saw at the very beginning with the younger kid that was playing the national anthem, that was in the biggest room. And then they had this small room that was playing this movie about Lester Rodney. Well, I was there with a family. It was probably like a younger boy and his parents. And you could, I mean, this is Kansas City, so you don't get many communists here. And they were really surprised to see a hammer and sickle in that video. They're like, whoa, they're kind of snickering about it. But by the end of the video, I remember the son, who was probably in his 20s, turns to his dad and goes, wow, you know, the left, or he said the socialists back then really knew, they were really on point with everything. And that to me is a win. It kind of reminds me of how Oppenheimer, the movie, is a win, in my opinion. It kind of humanizes us communists. But with no more further ado, let's go through these hands.
I find it interesting that a class about desegregation, and this is a class about desegregation, and I haven't heard a single name about any of these black players. No Jackie Robinson, which was an easy layup that we could have focused in on, or Doc Ellis or Satchel Paige.
We're gonna talk about those people in the next section.
I just want to know where the thought process was in terms of putting the focus on the people who were on the side of this.
Okay. Yeah. So I was saying, basically, thank you for that, comrade. I'll go ahead and pick up some slack and add some names. There is Fleet Walker. He was actually the first member of the MLB, black, African American, baseball player, catcher specifically, and he had joined in 1884, years before Lester Rodney was even born. As well as Satchel Paige. He was, alluded to in the documentary that Comrade had mentioned. This was a very close friend of Lester Rodney, actually. Also another black player who was, risking his livelihood in order to join the Major League Baseball League. One of the greatest pitchers of all time, even to this day.
Absolutely, from Kansas City Monarchs.
Just one little aside. I think to apply this, Lester Rodney was doing mass work. He was going to the masses, doing great work, and sticking to the popular front line, but making sure that he went to the masses and was a supportive role in order to gain the goodwill of the rank and file. That's the lesson that we should learn from him.
Okay, thank you for that. And we will continue with Comrade North Carolina. You have the floor.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment and then another comment on something said earlier. It's important to note that during this time when there was segregation in baseball, there was one team in the South, and that's Washington, D.C., which, I mean, that is a minority majority city for a long time. So segregation should not have been a thing there. The home state grades would eventually move there and make a lot more money than the Washington Senators did, and were a way better team. And I appreciate comment, but I also think it's important to again, we're going to get to this section, and the sacrifice of the Negro League players and other black athletes at this time is crucial. But it's also important to talk about how allies are able to work in a space to try to advocate, do the best that we can. Lester Rodney was a newspaper columnist and a World War II veteran. The best thing he could do is use his column to bring issues to it. We today, and I'm saying this obviously as a white man myself, and
9 seconds.
advocating for other groups. So I need to learn examples of how to do that for all groups. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Comrade Angelo, New York, you have the floor.
Remember, this is the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Now, remember that name. So our job is to show how communists, no matter what color they were, no matter what race or creed, that communists help to fight against racism. Everybody in the school system, I'm a former teacher, we don't teach that in the schools. We don't teach that the communists did anything that was positive. That was the point of this. It's not a color thing. It's a thing of communists. Satchel Paige was not a communist. Paul Robeson was. Both were black. But our job is to put the light on the communists, whether they're black or white, who are fighting against racism when the rest of the country was not. Thank you.
Thank you for that addition. And Comrade, keep your hand up. We will get back to you. We just have the last slides, and then we'll go break for questions for our last portion. So with that, now let's talk about the Negro Baseball League and breaking the color line in baseball. So this section here is Jim Crow Must Go. And so the Daily Worker sports writers also wrote often about the talented stars of the Negro Leagues and urged readers to attend black baseball games to see for themselves what the color line was denying them. The newspaper also informed its readers of the history of the Negro Leagues and how major league managers such as John McGraw of the New York Giants had praised the talents of its stars, and how McGraw himself had tried to sign a black player, Charlie Grant, in the early 1900s. And this was mentioned in the video too, how Lester Rodney actually interviewed Satchel Paige, and this is kind of, that's part of the article. So Burleigh Grimes was the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he admitted to Lester Rodney in an interview that he had been impressed with black players during off-season brainstorming games. Rodney mentioned, how would you feel about putting a Dodger uniform on Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson? The question made Grimes uncomfortable. You're wasting your time, he answered. That'll never happen as long as there are segregated trains in restaurants. And then Rodney responded with, can I say how good you think these players are? No, Grimes answered. He didn't want to stick his head out, Rodney said. And so there's a picture of Satchel Paige that was mentioned in Josh Gibson. So then there was a campaign to integrate blacks into the major leagues. And Lester Rodney mentions that it was the members of the YCL fanned out everywhere with petitions at the big league ballparks, and the Negro League games as well, busy street corners. They'd go up to people and ask, would you sign a petition to give Negro players a chance to play in the big leagues? And they got pretty good responses. Although Rodney coordinated the campaign, the underlying foundation for it was the Communist Party and the various institutions it set up. The actual implementation was in the hands of a middle level of Communist Party leadership, who were baseball fans and some of the leading people in the YCL. The live ones like Gil Green and Carl Ross, whose political imagination could grasp the implications of the campaign. And then there was Pete Calciccione, who was the communist city councilman from Brooklyn. And he also got it's in a big way. The top party leaders would give me an occasional pat on the back, but they had other things on their mind. Also, the trade unions joined the struggle. Or people in the trade unions really pushed the campaign. The NMU, the National Maritime Union, District 65, a huge union, mostly young workers with left leadership, and the Furs, that is the Fur Union. It came as a big shock to a lot of trade unionists that blacks weren't allowed in baseball. We had to educate them to the fact that there were black players good enough to play in the big leagues. Many of them have never heard of Satchel Paige. Over here on the right, in the spring of 1939, the campaign penetrated the halls of the New York State Legislature when State Senator Charles Perry from Harlem introduced a resolution originally drafted by the Daily Worker writer Mike Singer. In 1940, the momentum generated in 1939 kept picking up steam. And now other papers and groups, not just the Daily Worker, were getting into it. A major step was taken when the New York Trade Union Athletic Association, TUAA or TUA, threw its weight into the campaign. And there in the middle there, we see picketing that's happening within a union on May Day. That is the members of United Wholesale and Warehouse Workers Union. They're a union that was under the CIO. And so many unions consisted of young trade unionists reading the Daily Worker and in the party itself. They also had their own baseball teams. Also in 1939, the first paper in the country touted Jackie Robinson, then a student at Pasadena Junior College in California, as a major league prospect was the Daily Worker. And there's a picture of Jackie Robinson in his Brooklyn Dodgers outfit. And here's part of an article in the Daily Worker. Of the many fine Negro ball players I've seen in recent years, Jackie Robinson strikes me as having the best chance to cut the bink in organized bail. He's a quirky fielder, a darn good hitter, and a hell of a guy with a bunt. But it isn't until you've seen him on the bases that you realize what a tootsie he is. His extraordinary speed will drive pitchers crazy and bulk them to death. It wasn't until Branch Rickey, president and general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, signed Jackie Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers organization contract in 1945. Remember, he actually was signed with their Montreal farm team, and they were the Royals. The baseball color line was largely unaddressed by the mainstream sports media, while being vigorously denied by the baseball hierarchy, even while racial barriers were eroding in other sports. This was a new day for baseball and society, and the Worker praised itself and the Communist Party for helping to bring it about. Once again, they reminded their readers that they often had been the only daily newspaper to raise the issue. The Worker added that it would not be satisfied until there was no more segregation. We must crusade and fight for justice, even if we are alone. And there's a picture of Jackie Robinson. He actually served in the military in 1942 and 1944, where he actually met Joe Louis, who was also in the military. They met at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Most owners still hope to keep baseball white. Now their strategy was to keep integration confined to the Dodgers, while hoping Robinson would flop and keep the experiment to an end. Guess what? It doesn't work. We kept mentioning other black players we thought had major league potential, and Larry Doby was one of them. When Bill Vick, president of the Cleveland Guardians, which they were at the time the Indians, brought Doby directly up to Cleveland, he was consciously declaring the desegregation wouldn't be confined to the National League. It was a sensational move. Then Mike Gold wrote, "We must never cease to be that nerve over which oppression's pains are felt, otherwise unrecorded. We must keep on fighting until Jim Crow is ruined, finished, destroyed in every dirty root and fiber. I hope this victory will gladden the lonesome days of Lester Rodney and make him remember that his life has been important in the anti-fascist struggle. We owe a big bouquet to Lester Rodney." And there he is speaking to another baseball player. So now, with a bit of the time we have for about 10 minutes, we will actually discuss the Negro Baseball League. As you know, baseball was segregated before Jackie Robinson. And so this is another video that was playing at the museum. We'll play about 5 minutes of it.
When African-American ball players were shunned from the major leagues in the late 1800s, they started their own teams. Now, on the barnstorming circuit, outside the major leagues, they could play against white teams. It was soon obvious how good black players were at the great American game. In spite of all the sorrow it caused, segregation did inspire an institution that we were all proud of: Negro Leagues Baseball. Before it was all over, it became one of the largest African-American businesses in the country. Now, here in Kansas City, we're very proud of our heritage. The birth of the Negro Leagues took place here. Rube Foster was the man behind it. He'd been a player, a star player, you know. But his greatest contribution to the game was his understanding that it could only thrive, indeed survive, if it had some kind of formal structure. Other attempts at forming a league over the years had failed. Rube Foster had the winning formula. The organizational meeting took place right here in Kansas City, just a few blocks away. These are the teams that made up the Negro National League, the first enduring black league. Over the years, black players became known for playing the most exciting baseball, and Rube Foster encouraged it. He'd fine his players $5 if they were tagged out standing up. They were supposed to slide. By 1923, 400,000 black fans were turning out to enjoy the season. When white businessmen saw there was money to be made in segregated ball, through Ed Bolton, they formed the Eastern Colored League. 1924 saw the first Negro World Series between the Kansas City Monarchs and the Philadelphia Hilldales. The Monarchs won. The future was bright for black baseball, but unfortunately, as the decade wore on, Rube Foster's health failed and his leadership was missed. As the Depression caused fissures across our national economy, it rattled the Negro Leagues. Folks didn't have money to go to ball games. The Eastern Colored League had already died in 1928, and the Negro National League followed in 1931. But black baseball was very much alive. One white man who had a heart for it as well as a pocketbook was J.L. Wilkinson, owner of the Kansas City Monarchs. He mortgaged everything he had to pioneer night baseball by building a portable lighting system for his team. The Monarchs started night baseball with the 1930 season, 5 years before the major leagues discovered it. The results were fantastic. More people turned out for night baseball than even Sunday games. By 1933, a black gambler from Pittsburgh by the name of Gus Greenlee successfully revived the Negro Leagues. The climax of the season was the East-West All-Star Classic held in Chicago's Comiskey Park. It pitted the best of the East against the best of the West, and more than 20,000 fans attended. The East-West game was a tremendous showcase. It gave birth to the Negro League's finest heyday and stimulated financial growth from then through the mid-1940s. Gus Greenlee had some great times. In 1935, his team, the Pittsburgh Crawfords, had 5 of the league's finest stars on it: Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, Oscar Charleston, and Judy Johnson. All were future Hall of Famers. Satchel Paige was the highest paid player in Negro League history because for over 2 decades he drew the biggest crowds. He baffled hitters with his famous B-ball and hesitation pitch. When he pulled into town with his Satchel Paige All-Stars, he'd guarantee to strike out the first 9 batters, and he usually did. Satchel was a natural showman, and at a time when Major League games would draw only 8,000 people, 46,000 showed up to watch Satchel in action. He went on to become the oldest rookie in Major League history and the first Negro Leagues player to be inducted in the Major Leagues Hall of Fame. Josh Gibson was the greatest hitter in the Negro Leagues. People would compare him to Babe Ruth, say he was better than the Babe. Too bad he died so young, never saw the majors. But he and Buck Leonard teamed up batting back-to-back on the Homestead Grays to win the pennant 9 times in a row. Cool Papa Bell was so fast, his base running record still stands. They clocked him at 11 seconds. Satch used to say that Cool Papa Bell was so fast he could snap off the light, get into bed, and pull up the covers before the room went dark. Everyone went on alert with Cool Papa at bat. World War II was the end and the beginning of a lot of things. People couldn't help notice that our young black soldiers, segregated in their own units, were dying for freedom on foreign soil. Abroad, we fought racism. At home, we were asked to accept it. It took a white man to help it change. Branch Rickey, general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. As a young college coach, he watched a star player be shamed by the color of his skin when the team traveled. A hotel manager wouldn't register the young black catcher, and that experience etched Branch Rickey's soul. He was a religious man, though some would say the almighty dollar caused him to step out and recruit Jackie Robinson to be the first African-American in the major leagues. It was a big risk. Some teams even threatened not to play the Dodgers. But luckily, Branch Rickey had found himself an all-star.
Did you see Jackie Robinson hit that ball? He hit it, yes, and that ain't all. He's going home.
Yes, yes, Jackie's real gone.
After one season with Rickey's farm club in Montreal, Robinson was moved up to the Dodgers. Jackie Robinson, plucked as a rookie from the Kansas City Monarchs, brought honor to baseball and to his people. It's been said that the story of the 20th century can be divided before Jackie and after Jackie. Baseball in those days was said to be the national pastime. Finally, after Jackie, it truly was. We came together as one people to cheer, and that was good for the soul of America.
Okay, and yeah, that voice for the narration, that was James Earl Jones, the actor. All right, and that actually does end the slides for the class. So we'll go to our last breakout for discussion, and we'll prioritize comrades that haven't spoken yet. So, Comrade Georgia, you have the floor.
Where's like the Negro Leagues Museum and the museum where they had that Lester Rodney movie documentary?
It's in Kansas City, Missouri, 18th and Vine, and so they're open during work hours and the weekends. If you're ever down in Kansas City, let me know, and I'll take you around.
Yeah, one of the reasons participants may be saying certain things is that the class today brought up what our real heritage is. It was said right there at the end of the class, there were African Americans fighting in World War II, fighting for this country, for our country, not quote unquote the United States or the American entity, nothing like that, but the United States, our country. They were fighting for it. It was not fair to them, but they fought for it. And we've been fighting to improve it. And that's our history. That's our history, comrades. So we have to publicize it. It may not be popular, or may be the truth, but that's the way it happened. And we need to stick to our history. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that comment. All right, let's go with the other hands.
Yeah, to try to connect to try to connect the story to more recent time, we can't forget about players that came after Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby, like Curt Flood. A lot of people don't know who Curt Flood is, and the ramifications of what Curt Flood did is similar to like Jackie Robinson. Had ramifications not just in baseball but all sports in general. And Curt Flood was another black baseball player. Curt Flood took a stand in the 70s because at the time, players didn't have rights. The teams owned their rights, and they could do whatever they want with their players. In fact, Jackie Robinson retired because he was traded to the San Francisco Giants, who used to be the New York Giants, and they were big rivals with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And
60 seconds.
And this happened right after both teams moved to California, because he didn't want to play for his rival. But Curt Flood took a stand, and that's what created free agency in sports. And that's what allowed players the right to negotiate their own contracts with the sports teams. So that's a contribution we can't forget either.
No, thank you for that addition. I did not know that. Comrade North Carolina, you have the last comment for the night.
Yeah, I'll make this quick. We need to, homework for everybody, learn the history of desegregation in all sports. So we talked about baseball tonight. If you can't sit here and say who helped desegregate the NFL, the NHL, NBA, soccer, any of these kind of sports, that's homework we need to do. And we need a good list of players and administrators and everybody else who played a part in this. Just like we learn about, all our civil rights people, learn about them in sports, every sport. Do some research. There's some fantastic stuff out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And we will end with our final slides. Finally, we have New Outlook Publishers, and I'll hand it to no other than Staten Island. You have the floor.
Yes, please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. You can find a lot of great works there and help support the school. Proud to announce our latest release, From Socialism to Communism in the Soviet Union, Stalin's speech in 1939 on building communism within the Soviet Union. Please check that out.
Thank you very much. And I think we might still need you for this part.
And New Outlook Publishers is looking for volunteers as well. And please come join us. We're looking mostly for formatters and cover artists. Our next staff meeting is next month, August 28th at 8 p.m. And you can email me at scottp@johnreedcenter.net if interested.
And next, I will ask from New York for Harry Bridges School of Labor.
Yes, launched in the spring of 2023, the Harry Bridges School of Labor is a monthly class held twice per month. Our classes cover a variety of topics aimed at building class consciousness among union members. Our next class of the Harry Bridges School of Labor will be August 7th and 10th. And will be a viewing of the documentary Harlan County, USA on a strike in the 70s with mine workers. But also on top of that class, next week's PSMLS class will be a collaboration with the Harry Bridges School of Labor and the PSMLS on the life of Harry Bridges himself. So join us next week and you'll get a taste of what the Harry Bridges School is like.
Thank you very much, Comrade. That'll be a good one. And finally, we will end tonight's lesson with Frank Sinatra and The House I Live In.
And out, that's America to me. The things I see about me.